There are moments in life when silence is far more powerful than words. You see, knowing when to speak and when to remain silent is a skill, a discipline, and often a sign of wisdom. There are situations where your words, no matter how well-intentioned or logical, can make things worse. That's when silence becomes your greatest tool, your ally in navigating life's complexities. Think about it. When someone criticizes you in anger, what's your first reaction? For most people, it is to defend themselves. It's natural we want to set the record straight, explain our side of the story, maybe even argue back. But responding in that moment, when emotions are high, rarely leads to resolution. In fact, it usually escalates the situation. Why? Because when people are angry, they're not thinking rationally. Their minds are clouded by emotion, and they aren't in a place to listen or understand. Years ago, I had a colleague who was furious over a misunderstanding. He stormed into my office, slammed the door, and started unleashing a torrent of accusations. Now, everything in me wanted to respond, to tell him he was wrong, to defend my actions, but I knew that in that moment, nothing I said would matter. His mind was already made up. So I stayed silent. I listened to every word, not reacting, not interrupting, and after a while, he ran out of steam. His anger had no fuel to keep burning. When he finished, he left the room without me saying a single word. Later that day, he came back calm and collected, and we had a proper conversation. He apologized for his outburst, and we were able to resolve the issue without any lingering resentment. If I had jumped in during his angry tirade, it would have only escalated the conflict. But because I chose silence, I let the situation de-escalate, and in the end, it saved the relationship. This is a key principle in life. When someone is criticizing you in anger, don't feel the need to respond immediately. Silence can give both of you space to cool down, to think clearly, and to approach the situation with a level head. By staying silent, you maintain control over yourself, over your emotions, and ultimately over the situation. And that control is a sign of strength, not weakness. I once heard it said, you don't have to attend every argument you're invited to. That's powerful. Just because someone is angry or upset with you doesn't mean you need to engage in a battle of words. Sometimes the strongest response is no response at all. And here's the thing, excellence, in these moments doesn't mean you're agreeing with what's being said. It simply means you're choosing not to react in a way that will add more fuel to the fire. Imagine you're standing in front of a bonfire. The flames are high, the heat intense. Now, you have two options. You can throw more wood onto the fire, making it blaze even hotter, or you can let the flames burn themselves out. That's what silence does. It allows the flames of anger to die down on their own. Words, on the other hand, can act like wood feeding the fire, making it grow until it's out of control. But let me be clear. Silence isn't always about not speaking at all. Sometimes it's about timing. When the moment is right, when the other person is calmed down, that's when you can have a meaningful conversation. That's when you can address the issues at hand with clarity and understanding. But that moment won't come if you jump into the fray too soon. You've got to let the storm pass before you can navigate through it. Another critical time to be silent is when you're caught up in excitement. You're feeling great, everything's going your way, and you're tempted to make promises. You're on top of the world, and it feels like you can accomplish anything, so you start committing to things left and right. You tell people you'll do this, you'll help with that, you'll take on this new project. In the heat of the moment, it all seems possible. But here's the danger. Promises made in the midst of excitement are often promises that are hard to keep. Enthusiasm can make you overestimate your capacity, and when that initial rush fades, you're left with a mountain of commitments that you're not sure how to fulfill. The problem is when you don't keep your promises, it doesn't just affect your credibility with others, it affects your credibility with yourself. I've seen this happen time and time again. Someone gets fired up about a new opportunity, a new goal, and in their excitement, they commit to too much. Maybe they promise to help with a project that's outside their expertise, or they agree to take on more responsibility than they can handle. And at first, it feels great. But as time goes on, the reality of those commitments sets in. They find themselves overwhelmed, stressed, and struggling to keep up. Eventually, they have to backtrack on their promises, and that's when the real damage is done. Now, I'm not saying you shouldn't be excited. Excitement is a wonderful thing. It's the fuel that drives us forward, that gets us moving toward our goals. But excitement, like fire, needs to be managed. If you let it burn out of control, it can consume you. That's why in moments of high excitement, it's important to be silent. Don't make promises or commitments in the heat of the moment. Give yourself time to think, to reflect, to consider what's realistic. I remember a young man who came up to me after one of my seminars. He was so excited about everything he'd learned, so inspired by the possibilities ahead of him. He told me he was going to change his life, start a business, quit his job, run a marathon, and learn a new language all in the next 6 months. I admired his enthusiasm, but I also knew he was setting himself up for failure. He was making promises to himself in the heat of the moment without taking the time to consider the reality of what he was committing to. A year later, I saw him again. He was discouraged, burnt out, and frustrated. He hadn't accomplished any of the things he'd set out to do, and he felt like a failure. The problem wasn't his ambition or his goals. The problem was that he'd made too many promises when he was caught up in excitement. He hadn't given himself time to think things through, to plan, to prioritize. So the next time you feel that rush of excitement, remember to be silent. Give yourself space to let the excitement settle. Don't make promises right away. Take time to consider what's realistic, what's achievable, and what's truly important. Silence in those moments isn't about dampening your enthusiasm. It's about channeling it in a way that sets you up for success, not disappointment. Here's another time when silence is the best course of action. When you don't have all the facts. Now, this is a big one. How many times have you seen someone jump into a conversation, offer their opinion, or give advice without knowing the whole story? It happens all the time. People love to talk, love to share their thoughts, Seven, when they don't fully understand what's going on. And more often than not, this leads to misunderstanding, confusion, and sometimes even conflict. I learned early on that it's better to be silent and listen than to speak when you don't have all the information. I remember a business meeting many years ago where one of the executives started offering solutions to a problem before he fully understood what the problem was. He jumped in with all sorts of ideas, eager to show his expertise, but he hadn't taken the time to ask the right questions or gather the necessary information. As a result, his suggestions were completely off base, and the meeting went in circles for far longer than it needed to because he didn't remain silent when he didn't have all the facts. Silence is a sign of wisdom. It shows that you're willing to listen, to learn, to understand before you speak. And when you do finally speak, your words will carry more weight because they're grounded in knowledge, not assumption. And here's another one that we cannot neglect: the power of remaining silent when you don't have all the facts. You see, in many situations, people rush to fill the silence with their opinions, advice, or assumptions. There's an almost instinctual need to say something to prove they're engaged, to demonstrate their knowledge, or simply to avoid the discomfort of silence. But here's where the real wisdom comes into play. Silence allows you to gather more information, to see the situation from different angles, and to avoid unnecessary conflict. I remember a time when I was working with a team of executives on a major project. One of the newer members of the team was eager to make his mark. In a meeting, he was quick to offer solutions, quick to jump in with ideas, even though he hadn't fully understood the scope of the problem. Now, his enthusiasm was commendable, but his lack of information was dangerous. His suggestions, though well-intentioned, were not relevant to the actual issue we were facing. The rest of the team had to spend extra time re-explaining the situation, and in the end, the entire meeting was less productive because of it. Had he chosen to be silent to listen first, he could have offered something far more valuable. This isn't about staying silent forever. It's about being silent until you know enough to contribute meaningfully. There's a great saying: it's better to remain silent and be thought a fool than to speak and remove all doubt. That's a bit humorous, but there's a lot of truth in it. The less you say when you're unsure, the wiser you seem. But the benefit of silence when you don't have all the facts goes beyond just avoiding embarrassment. It helps you build credibility. When people know that you speak only when you're well informed, they'll listen more carefully. When you do speak, your words will carry more weight because they're rooted in understanding. You'll become someone whose opinion is trusted not because you always have something to say, but because when you do say something, it's worth hearing. Another situation where silence is crucial: when someone else is sharing something important, something personal, something emotional. This is where a lot of people make a mistake. When someone opens up about their struggles, their fears, or their pain, the instinct is often to jump in with advice, to try to fix the problem, to say something that will make them feel better. But here's the thing: sometimes people don't need your words. They don't need your advice. They just need you to listen. I learned this lesson the hard way early in my career. I was mentoring a young man who was going through a difficult time in his life. He came to me pouring out his heart, telling me about the challenges he was facing, the fears he had, and the uncertainty that was weighing him down. And what did I do? I immediately jumped in with advice. I told him what he needed to do, how he needed to think, and what steps he should take. I thought I was helping him, but here's what I didn't realize at the time. He wasn't looking for advice. He wasn't looking for a solution. He was looking for someone to listen, to acknowledge what he was feeling, to sit with him in that moment of vulnerability. By jumping in with my words, I missed an opportunity to connect with him on a deeper level. I missed the chance to offer the kind of support that only silence can provide. You see, silence in these moments isn't about doing nothing. It's about being fully present. It's about showing the other person that you're there with them, that you're listening, that you're creating space for them to express themselves. And sometimes that's all they need. Just the act of being heard can be incredibly powerful. It can provide comfort, reassurance, and healing in a way that words often can't. When someone is sharing something personal or emotional, resist the urge to fill the space with your own thoughts, opinions, or advice. Instead, offer them the gift of silence. Let them speak. Let them share. And let your silence be a sign of your attention, your empathy, your understanding. Now, silence in these situations also teaches us something important about our own needs. How many times have you found yourself sharing something difficult with someone only to have them immediately offer advice or solutions? How did that make you feel? Often it can feel dismissive, like they're not truly hearing you. They may mean well, but by jumping in too quickly, they miss the depth of what you're trying to communicate. That's why silence is so powerful. It allows the other person to fully express themselves without interruption, without judgment, without the pressure of having to listen to your response. And in doing so, it shows them that they matter, that their feelings, their experiences, their story is important enough for you to simply listen. Another important time to be silent is when you're about to make a major decision. Too often people rush into decisions, speaking their mind, declaring their intentions before they've had a chance to fully consider the consequences. But silence, taking the time to reflect, to think, to weigh the pros and cons, can save you from making a decision you'll later regret. I've seen this happen in business all too often. Someone gets an idea, and in their excitement, they immediately start talking about it, sharing it with others, committing to it before they've fully thought it through. And what happens? They realize later that they didn't consider all the angles, didn't foresee the challenges, didn't think about the long-term implications. But by that point, they've already spoken their intentions, and now they're locked into a course of action that may not be the best one. That's why silence is so valuable when you're on the brink of a major decision. It gives you the space to think, to gather more information, to consider different perspectives. It prevents you from rushing into something based on impulse or emotion. And when you finally do speak, when you finally do make that decision, you can do so with confidence, knowing that you've thought it through, that you've weighed the options, that you're making the best choice. I remember a time early in my career when I was presented with a business opportunity. It seemed like a great idea at first glance, exciting, full of potential. I was tempted to jump in right away, to say yes, to commit, but something told me to pause, to remain silent, to give myself time to think, and I'm glad I did. After doing more research, after talking to a few trusted advisors, I realized that the opportunity wasn't as great as it seemed. There were hidden risks, challenges I hadn't considered, and in the end, I decided not to pursue it. Had I spoken too soon, had I made a decision in the heat of the moment, I would have found myself in a difficult situation later on. This is the power of silence. It gives you time to reflect, time to gather more information, time to consider the long-term implications of your decisions. And that time, that silence can make all the difference between success and failure, between making a wise decision and a hasty one. But here's something else to consider. Silence and decision-making isn't just about what's happening on the outside, it's also about what's happening on the inside. When you give yourself the gift of silence, you create space for clarity. You allow your mind to settle, your thoughts to organize themselves, your intuition to speak. And that inner clarity is often what leads to the best decisions. So, the next time you're faced with a major decision, resist the urge to speak too soon. Resist the temptation to commit before you've had time to think it through. Instead, be silent. Give yourself the time and space to reflect. And when you do speak, when you do make your decision, you'll do so from a place of confidence, wisdom, and clarity. And there's one more crucial moment where silence is golden when you're in the presence of greatness. When you're around someone who has achieved what you aspire to, someone whose wisdom and experience far surpass your own, that's a time to listen more and talk less. So many people make the mistake of trying to impress those who are further along the path. They try to show what they know, to prove their worth through words. But what they don't realize is that true learning comes through listening. When you find yourself in the presence of someone with great wisdom or experience, the natural inclination might be to show them how much you know, to talk about your own ideas, or to share your accomplishments. But here's the key truth. Those who have truly achieved greatness aren't impressed by how much you can talk, they're impressed by how much you're willing to learn. And the only way to learn from those who have walked a path you haven't is through silence and listening. I remember one of my early mentors, Mr. Schulf. Mr. Schulf was a man of tremendous success, and every time I was around him, I was eager to learn. But in those moments, I didn't do the talking, I let him speak. I soaked up every word he said. Mr. Schulf had something I wanted: success, wisdom, understanding. And I knew that if I spent my time trying to impress him with what I knew, I'd miss out on what he could teach me. I wasn't there to show off my knowledge. I was there to absorb his. Here's what you got to understand. Greatness doesn't need to be acknowledged. Those who have achieved it don't need you to validate them by telling them how much you know. They already know what they've accomplished. What they appreciate, what they respect, is the humility of someone who knows when to be quiet and listen. There's a time for asking questions, but the deeper questions come when you've already listened intently, when you've absorbed the foundational wisdom that's being offered. And I'm telling you, the lessons I learned from Mr. Schultz didn't just come from the words he spoke. They came from his demeanor, from the way he handled himself in business, from his attitude toward life. If I had been busy talking, if I had been trying to impress him, I would have missed all of that. But because I was silent, because I listened, I was able to learn things that went far beyond what he said. His actions, his presence, his way of thinking, it all spoke volumes. But I only received those lessons because I was willing to be quiet and let the greatness around me do the teaching. Think about this. When you speak, you're only repeating what you already know. But when you listen, you're opening yourself up to learn something new. That's why silence in the presence of greatness is so important. It's an opportunity to expand your mind, to gain insights that you couldn't get on your own. And the only way to seize that opportunity is to stop talking and start listening. This principle applies not just to individuals, but to any situation where you're in the presence of something larger than yourself. It could be a profound idea, a complex challenge, or a significant event. Silence allows you to fully absorb the gravity of the moment. It's in those quiet moments that you gain perspective, that you see the bigger picture, that you come to understand things in a deeper way. Silence in the presence of greatness also teaches you humility. It reminds you that no matter how much you know, there's always more to learn. It puts you in the mindset of a student, and that's one of the most powerful places you can be. When you approach life as a student, when you're willing to be quiet and learn from those who have gone before you, the world opens up to you in ways you never imagined. I've often said the more you know, the more you realize how much you don't know. And that realization doesn't come through speaking, it comes through listening, through observing, through taking in the wisdom and experience of others. Greatness is often quiet, subtle, and it reveals itself to those who are patient enough to sit in silence and absorb its lessons. Now, let's consider another scenario where silence is invaluable, when you're being provoked. This one is tough. There will be times in your life when people deliberately try to get under your skin, when they push your buttons, when they say or do things just to get a reaction out of you. Maybe it's out of jealousy, maybe it's insecurity on their part, or maybe it's just their nature to be confrontational. Whatever the reason, you'll face moments when people will provoke you, hoping you'll respond in anger or frustration. In those moments, the temptation to react can be overwhelming. You feel your heart rate rise, your face gets hot, and you just want to say something to defend yourself or to put the other person in their place. But here's the truth. Reacting in those moments almost never serves you well. When you react to provocation, you're giving the other person exactly what they want, you're playing into their hands, and more often than not, you'll say or do something that you'll later regret. I had a mentor once who told me, Jim, when someone tries to pull you into their storm, you don't have to go. And that's the essence of silence. When you're being provoked, silence in these moments isn't about weakness or submission, it's about strength. It's about having the self-control to remain calm, to rise above the situation, to refuse to let someone else dictate your emotions. I've seen it time and again in business, in relationships, in everyday life. Someone says something hurtful or insulting, hoping to get a rise out of you. And the person who remains silent, who doesn't take the bait, is the one who walks away with their dignity intact. Silence in those moments is a sign of maturity. It shows that you're not swayed by the negativity of others, that you're in control of your own emotions and reaction. And here's another thing to keep in mind. When you remain silent in the face of provocation, it often disarms the other person. They're expecting a reaction. They're ready for a fight. But when you don't engage, when you don't give them what they're looking for, it throws them off balance. It forces them to confront their own behavior, their own motives. Silence becomes a mirror that reflects their negativity back at them. I remember a story about a businessman I once worked with. He was constantly dealing with a competitor who loved to provoke him. This competitor would spread rumors, criticize him publicly, and do whatever he could to get a reaction. And for a while, my friend would respond. He'd defend himself. He'd argue back. He'd let the competitor drag him into a verbal sparring match. But it didn't help. In fact, it made things worse. One day, my friend decided to try a different approach. The next time his competitor tried to provoke him, he stayed silent. He didn't respond. He didn't acknowledge the insults. He simply went about his business, and something interesting happened. The competitor lost his power. Without a reaction to feed off, his provocations fell flat. Over time, he stopped trying to provoke my friend altogether. And my friend's reputation grew stronger because he was seen as someone who wasn't easily rattled. That's the power of silence in the face of provocation. It shows strength, it shows self-control, and it ultimately gives you the upper hand. Silence allows you to rise above the fray, to maintain your composure, and to walk away with your dignity intact. But here's an important point. Silence doesn't mean you're suppressing your emotions. It doesn't mean you're bottling up your feelings or avoiding the issue. It means you're choosing not to react in the heat of the moment. You're giving yourself time to process, to think, to decide how you want to respond, if you even need to respond at all. Silence creates a buffer, a space where you can regain control of your emotions and make decisions from a place of clarity rather than impulsiveness. And that's one of the greatest lessons of silence. It gives you time to think, time to reflect, time to regain your balance. In a world that often pressures us to react immediately, to speak without thinking, to respond without fully understanding, silence is a gift. It allows you to step back, to breathe, to regain your composure before you take action. So the next time you find yourself in a situation where someone is trying to provoke you, where they're pushing your buttons and hoping for a reaction, remember the power of silence. Don't feel the need to engage. Don't let them pull you into their storm. Stay calm, stay silent, and let your silence speak for you. You'll be amazed at how much power that can give you. And let's not forget, silence in all of these situations isn't just about avoiding conflict or staying out of trouble. It's about cultivating inner peace. It's about knowing that you don't have to react to everything that happens around you. You don't have to have an opinion on everything. You don't have to respond to every criticism, every provocation, every challenge. Silence teaches you that sometimes the best response is no response at all. And when you master the art of silence, when you know when to speak and when to stay quiet, you'll find that you're not just navigating life more effectively, you're also living with more peace, more wisdom, and more strength.